The University of Michigan's Faculty Senate, which has been called to hear the Senate's 16th Annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. Our first order of business is for me to introduce the President of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund. For the past 15 years, I have sat in the audience, never imagining that I'd have the privilege of introducing Dr. Peggy J. Hollingsworth to you. Dr. Hollingsworth was chair of our Faculty Senate and of the Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs in 1990, when the Senate Assembly created this annual lecture as a constant reminder of the importance of academic and intellectual freedom, and to honor 3 former members of our faculty who were persecuted at the University of Michigan during the notorious McCarthy era of the late 1940s and 1950s. When the Senate Assembly created the lecture series, it also established a fund to provide financial support for the annual lecture and related events. Since 1992, Dr. Hollingsworth has been president of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund. I am not going to review for you the very impressive curriculum vitae of Dr. Hollingsworth, as have done previous chairs of the Faculty Senate. Instead, I am going to share with you a few personal observations. When the lecture series was established, it lacked the support of both the university's administration and its Board of Regents. In the ensuing years, this lecture has become one of the major events of our academic year, held in high esteem by members of the entire academic community, students, faculty, staff, administrators, and members of the Board of Regents. To accomplish this success in the face of adversity has required the dedication and determination of a zealot. Of course, Dr. Hollingsworth could not have been so successful had the lecture series not received the personal and financial support of the donors to the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund and members of the American Association of University Professors, the Faculty Senate and its governing bodies, and the community at large. Dr. Hollingsworth has devoted countless hours to seeking out and enticing to our university the stellar scholars, all staunch advocates of academic and intellectual freedom, who have delivered this annual lecture. She has also been similarly dedicated to raising the funds needed to sustain the lecture series. I know from personal experience that the warm welcome and thoughtful attention that she has given to the comfort of our speakers has not only produced a body of fascinating new friends for her and her lucky husband, but for the University of Michigan as well. I would now like to ask my closest companion, my dearest friend, and my beloved wife, Dr. Peggy J. Hollingsworth, President of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, to address you.
I don't usually get a hug from the people who introduce me. Not only does he do wonderful introductions, he also has chauffeured all of our wonderful speakers. He feeds me, he's our cook, and he's our gardener. So I think I'll keep him for just a little bit longer. Welcome to the 16th Annual University of Michigan Senate's Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. The academic and intellectual freedom that is so integral to our educational system and of such great importance to the American society results from the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble or petition the government for a redress of grievances. Professors from the University of Michigan have played key roles in protecting and preserving academic and intellectual freedom. In 1913, 93 years ago, a distinguished group of 34 professors, led by Columbia University professor John Dewey, met to form an organization which would address issues of concern to the professoriate, including the concept of tenure and its relationship to academic and intellectual freedom. The University of Michigan was represented in that group by geology professor William Herbert Hobbs. When 250 professors from America's major universities and colleges met 15 months later at the Chemist Club in New York City on January 1, 1915, University of Michigan physics professor Carl Eugen Goethe was the first to speak to a motion to establish the American Association of University Professors. In 1911, the University of Michigan had established its graduate department with Professor Goethe as its first dean. The graduate department is today the Horace H. Rackham School of Graduate Studies. Nearly 50 years later, University of Michigan President Harlan Hatcher suspended biology assistant professor Clement Markert and fired tenured pharmacology associate professor Mark Nickerson for exerting their right to protection against self-incrimination granted by the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution when testifying before a subcommittee of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. President Hatcher also fired mathematics instructor Chandler Davis, who refused to testify solely on the basis of his First Amendment rights. Because President Hatcher had fired Professor Nickerson in the face of overwhelming advice from members of the university faculty not to take such an action, the American Association of University Professors in 1957 placed the university on its list of censured colleges and universities, signaling to the academic world that faculty and students could not expect to enjoy the benefits of academic and intellectual freedom at the University of Michigan. Within a year, the regents of the University of Michigan changed the regental bylaws, believing that the new bylaws would prevent a university professor from terminating without proper and sufficient cause a faculty member's tenure, and the American Association of University Professors removed Michigan from its list of censured institutions. In the late 1980s, University of Michigan history professor David Hollinger, now a distinguished professor and chair of the history department at the University of California at Berkeley, wrote a history of the McCarthy era at the University of Michigan. And Adam Kulenkaw, an undergraduate senior majoring in English, submitted for his honors dissertation a video entitled Keeping in Mind the McCarthy Era at the University of Michigan. Consequently, many faculty members call for an action of reconciliation to be made to the 3 dismissed faculty members. When this request was rejected by both the university administration and the Board of Regents, the University of Michigan Senate Assembly created an annual lecture to be named the University of Michigan Senate's Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. Professor Davis, now an emeritus professor of mathematics at the University of Toronto, is with us today. Will you stand up, Chandler, so that we can recognize you? The purpose of this annual lecture is to demonstrate that academic and intellectual freedom lies at the heart of the university and are key values for our democratic society. And that, as the cases of Professors Davis, Markert, and Nickerson show, the university must be vigilant in the protection of these freedoms, continuing to remind itself of their value and vulnerability. When the lecture was established, a fund called the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund was also set up to finance the annual lecture and related activities. The first lecture was delivered by Professor Robert O'Neill on February 18, 1991. Today, you will hear the 16th lecture in the annual series. Each of the 15 past lectures has been an outstanding scholar who, through research, public service, the arts, or contributions to public discourse, has shown an enduring and extraordinary commitment to the values of intellectual freedom, especially as they relate to academic freedom. Of the first 15 lectures, there have been 6 constitutional lawyers, 3 historians, 3 members of the press, 1 sociologist, 1 linguist, and 1 English scholar. Of that group, 3 have served as presidents of major universities, including Brown and Columbia universities. and of the University of Michigan, Virginia, and Wisconsin. One has been a dean of a graduate school, 2 have headed major foundations, 1 was the president of the American Association of University Professors, and 14 have been or are university professors. Each has demonstrated active personal engagement in the defense of the values of intellectual and/or academic freedom in some aspect of their careers. This year's speaker is clearly a worthy addition to this distinguished group. Time does not permit me to personally thank each group that has contributed in some way to the success of this year's lecture. Acknowledgments are made in your program. However, I would like to express my appreciation and that of those who have worked with me on this lecture series to you who are attending this lecture today for the steadfast support that you have given over the past 16 years. I would now like to ask the 13th president of the University of Michigan. Yeah, that would be cute. University of Michigan, Mary Sue Coleman, to introduce the 16th annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture. President Coleman.
Earlier this year, a book came out with a very salacious title, The 101 Most Dangerous Academics in America. 2 members of the Michigan faculty are highlighted in this book. And that doesn't sit well with some of our other faculty. Not because their colleagues are being impugned, but because they themselves are not included in a book that purports to expose a perverse culture of academics who are poisoning the minds of today's college students. If university professors with strong and diverse opinions are polluting the minds of students, one can only theorize that the executive editor of the New York Times is doing to millions of readers with his unparalleled publication. Newspaper editors do not like to become part of the stories they report. But its executive editor of the Times, Bill Keller, has found himself the target of vituperation from politicians, columnists, and bloggers for the Times coverage of the Bush administration and the war on terror. 2 stories stand out. The first, published last December, chronicled how the administration, without court warrants, authorized the eavesdropping of foreign phone calls into the United States. That story won the Pulitzer Prize. The second story appeared this past June and told of how the federal government is monitoring Americans' bank transactions in search of terrorists. The President of the United States has called the Times coverage disgraceful, the Vice President disturbing. A congressman implied the Times violated federal laws against espionage, and a radio talk host called for Mr. Keller to be sent to the electric chair. Fire it up, he said. Mr. Keller has described his status as the favorite chew toy of both the right and the left. Bill Keller has been with the New York Times since 1984. As a correspondent, he worked in bureaus in Washington, Moscow, and Johannesburg. His exceptional coverage of the fall of the Soviet Union was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. He's been a foreign editor, a columnist and managing editor, and was named the Times executive editor in 2003. Last month, student journalists here at the university hosted a conference on the First Amendment. The keynote speaker was author and Newsweek columnist Ellis Coase, who told our students, "A greater danger than a press that offends is a press afraid to offend." The same philosophy applies to university faculty. Academic freedom is a First Amendment right and is essential to the life of the mind. Our annual lecture on academic and intellectual freedom and the exceptional speakers it attracts remind us of this most cherished value of American higher education. Mr. Keller, we welcome you to the University of Michigan, and we look forward to your talk.
Let's try that. Okay. How's that? This is the law school, not the engineering school, obviously. I believe Justice Scalia referred to it as a super-duper law school. It's about the only kind thing he had to say about the University of Michigan. So you want to just stand there and hold it? Okay, good. I'll try not to bump it. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I was sort of hoping my wife would be here to introduce me. But she wouldn't have been nearly that kind, but I would have gotten a kiss afterwards. I guess you can all afford to be magnanimous to a visiting New Yorker after the way the Tigers humiliated the Yankees. In the interest of candor, I should tell you that one of the reasons I went into print journalism was that the other likely career track for an English lit major was teaching, and the idea of standing up in front of people and lecturing for 50 minutes filled me with nervous dread, and still does. I ran into our publisher on Friday and told him I was a little worried that I only had about 25 minutes worth of material, and his advice was, speak very slowly. I'm not going to do that. But while I'm bearing my soul, I also want to confess to a minor violation of intellectual property rights. The title of this lecture, Editors in Chains, is expropriated from a column on Slate by the press critic Jack Schaefer. Schaefer's actual title was Bill Keller in Chains, but I amended it because misery loves company. I think Schaefer intended the title to be more or less facetious, and so do I. Although these days I do take more of a personal interest in the debate over how the country treats detainees. On my desk in New York, I keep two pieces of reader feedback, both from a couple of years that I spent in blissful exile as a columnist for the Times. One of these mementos is a response to a column in which I referred to California, where I was born and raised, as, quote, this great freak show of a state. I meant that in a loving way, but it earned me a scolding editorial in a paper called the Central Coast Tribune. And all you need to know is the headline, "Stuff it, Mr. Keller." My all-time favorite, however, is still a postcard that I received from an angry nun named Sister Veronica McRooney after I wrote a column that suggested certain similarities between the Kremlin and the Vatican. The postcard was a picture of the Pope with Cardinal O'Connor, and the message was typed on the back with a typewriter. Quote, obey your holy priests and bishops or risk excommunication, anathema, and eternal hellfire. 2 exclamation points. Now, as the wayward product of a Catholic education, I can tell you that I responded to that postcard by sitting up straight and folding my hands on my desk where Sister could see them. And when I finally got my current job in 2003, I took the Stuff It editorial and the Eternal Hellfire postcard and propped them on my desk to remind myself to be humble. As it turned out, I would have lots and lots of other reminders. The people who wake up every morning intent on keeping me humble include the faith-based partisans of the right and left, the vigilantes of the blogosphere, the radio talk show hosts and television shouting heads, the bottom feeders of our hometown gossip columns, and a legion of media obsessives. Our critics include readers of the New York Times, a bright, engaged, and opinionated audience that is still convinced we signed on with the Satanists when we moved their Sunday TV guide to the website. On top of all that, we actually pay somebody good money, a public editor we call him, to periodically griddle me in the pages of the New York Times. So as a staunch believer in free speech, I am regularly hoist on my own petard. All of this comes at a time when my industry is preoccupied by intimations of its own mortality. Many daily newspapers are staggering from an exodus of subscribers, a migration of advertisers to the web, and the rising cost of just about everything. At places where editors and publishers gather, the mood these days is grim. People ask, "How are you?" in that tone of voice that you might adopt for friends who've just emerged from rehab or been through a really rough divorce. I'm not one of those who believe that newspapers are doomed, and I will save my eccentric optimism on that subject for another lecture. But it's a little disconcerting to know that there are people waiting to dance on your grave. Earlier this year, the New York Times announced that it would be converting to a narrower page format, and somebody immediately posted a message that shot around the right-wing blogosphere, quote, 1.5 inches down, 12 inches to go. I have to say, angry people on the right tend to be funnier than angry people on the left, but maybe that's just my impression. Although I am accustomed, as President Coleman said, to being a chew toy for the right and left, nothing the Times has done has caused quite so much official agitation as the two stories that she referred to. One article, which, as she said, was published last year and won a Pulitzer Prize, revealed that the National Security Agency was eavesdropping on domestic phone and email conversations without the legal courtesy of a warrant. And the other, published in June of this year, described a large Treasury Department program to screen international banking records. Both of these programs, the domestic eavesdropping and the banking surveillance, were designed to catch terrorists. And in case you're wondering, like most Americans, I'm in favor of that. Both of these programs were highly classified, so classified, in fact, that some members of Congress who would normally expect to have oversight over such activities were kept out of the loop. In both cases, senior officials of our government argued strenuously beforehand that the Times should not publish, that to do so would give a lethal advantage to enemies of America. My only experience of the Bush Oval Office was a visit in which the President advised me that if we revealed the warrantless eavesdropping program, the Times should expect to be held accountable for the next terrorist attack on America. That's not a warning that anybody takes lightly or soon forgets. The White House reaction when we decided to publish the eavesdropping story over the President's objection was predictably fierce. The administration defended the program aggressively and meanwhile ordered the FBI to begin a leak investigation in search of our sources. That investigation has evolved into a grand jury proceeding and could ultimately entail subpoenas of our reporters, followed by yet another court battle over how the press does its job. After our second offense, the publication of the story about banking surveillance, the administration cranked up the outrage to a deafening volume that would probably violate Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. In the course of 3 days, the Vice President, and then the President, and then the Treasury Secretary took turns denouncing us as disgraceful and indifferent to the national interest. Many members of Congress held a festival of indignation on the House floor, where my paper was accused of treason. Following hard upon the official tirade, we had an amen chorus of voices questioning our motives, impugning our integrity, and suggesting appropriate sanctions. A polemic by Gabriel Schoenfeld in the March issue of the magazine Commentary proposed that the Times be charged under Section 798 of the Espionage Act, which declares that it is a crime in some circumstances to publish information about national defense, government codes, and communications intelligence activities. This provoked Jack Schaefer to write the aforementioned essay, Bill Keller in Chains, which I should say came down on my side. He concluded that prosecuting editors under this statute would probably collide head-on with the First Amendment. The prospect of Times editors and reporters doing hard time was not nearly enough for a right-wing radio pundit out in San Francisco who achieved her first flicker of national attention by suggesting that I should go to the gas chamber. Another stalwart defender of the national interest posted a map to my apartment on the internet with an invitation to terrorists and lunatics. If any of you are acquainted with New York apartment life, you can imagine how that went over with my co-op board. You might ask why the thundering wrath of the administration and its friends focused almost exclusively on the New York Times when 3 other leading newspapers chased our banking story onto their front pages the same day. I hope you won't be too shocked or disillusioned if I suggest that politics had something to do with it. This is an election year, and it is widely believed that nothing plays better in red states than beating up on the newspaper from Sodom on the Hudson, the home of MTV and Hillary Clinton and the United Nations and the Yankees and every other godless menace. In any case, it plays much better than beating up on, say, the Wall Street Journal, which has an editorial page that resembles Vice President Cheney's id. As it happens, the Wall Street Journal was one of those papers that published the banking surveillance story. An excellent reporter from the Journal named Glenn Simpson was hot on our heels, and his paper splashed its account of that secret program on its front page the same day that we did. This required the Journal's conservative editorial writers to perform an impressive feat of logical contortion, condemning the Times while exonerating their colleagues in the Journal's own newsroom. The argument seemed to be that what we did was unpatriotic, but what the Journal reporter did was okay because nobody asked him not to. Speaking of being hoist on my own petard, I was actually a member of the jury on commentary the year that the columnist Paul Gigot won his Pulitzer Prize. He's now the editor of the Journal editorial page, so no good deed goes unpunished. The reaction to our coverage of the administration's anti-terror measures did not consist entirely of editorial bloviating, electioneering, and toxic partisanship. I'm pretty sure the White House outburst reflected genuine frustration, a conviction that in perilous times the president needs extraordinary powers, unfettered by congressional oversight, court meddling, or the strictures of international law, and certainly safe from the attention of nosy reporters. And in the public realm, I know there is a real confusion about why somebody like me should be able to defy the wishes of the President of the United States on a matter as unquestionably urgent as protecting the country from homicidal enemies. Before I attempt to answer that question, let me digress for a few minutes to state a basic creed of journalism, or at least the kind of journalism we try to practice at the New York Times. What I'm about to say is taken as a given by most people who work in the serious news media, yet it is regarded by many people outside my business with suspicion verging on disbelief. But it's vital context for the rest of what I have to say today. The principle, as essential to us as any oath taken by any public official, is that we strive to be independent and impartial. Even with audiences who are well-read and world-savvy, I'm constantly surprised by the presumption of bad faith when people talk about our business. The confusion is in some measure the fault of our own shortcomings, the well-publicized examples of journalistic malfeasance, the episodes of credulous reporting in the prelude to the war in Iraq, the retreat of some news organizations from serious news into celebrity gossip, and so on. It also reflects the fact that we live in cynical times, in a polarized society, and in a clamorous new media world of hyperventilating advocacy. One of my colleagues at our sister paper, the Boston Globe, surveyed a number of editors and reporters within our company a while back in an attempt to identify the essentials that set us apart as serious journalists. And at the risk of sounding didactic, I would like to list a few of the main points. One, we believe in a journalism of verification rather than assertion, meaning we put a higher premium on accuracy than on speed or sensation. When we report information, we look hard to see if it stands up to scrutiny, and when we get it wrong, we correct our mistakes as quickly and forthrightly as possible. Two, we believe in transparency. That is, we aim to tell you how we know what we know, to attribute our information as much as possible to named sources, to rely on documentary evidence when we can. As your math teacher might have said, we show our work. Three, we are agnostic as to where a story may lead. We do not go into a story with an agenda or a preconceived notion. We do not manipulate or hide facts to advance an agenda. We strive to preserve our independence from political and economic interests. We do not work in the service of a party or an industry or even a country. And when there are competing views of a situation, we aim to reflect them as clearly and fairly as we can. It's worth belaboring this particular point just a little. Newspapers are, in addition to sources of news, forums for punditry and public debate, but we try to prevent the opinions of our writers and editors from leaching into our news pages. Even sophisticated readers of the New York Times are often surprised to learn that I edit every page of the paper except two, the opinion pages, where the editorials and columnists hold forth. I have nothing to do with the daily editorials. I do not conspire with Frank Rich and Maureen Dowd in their tireless effort to surrender America to the heathens. I oversee a newsroom of 1,200 people, reporters, editors, photographers, graphic artists, designers, and so on. Every one of them, I expect, has opinions about a lot of things. That's fine by me. But just as doctors and lawyers and teachers and military officers and judges and police are sometimes expected to set aside their personal politics in performance of their duties, So are our employees. And finally, on my short list of precepts, fourth, we don't do this as a hobby but as a living. Whether you call it a craft or a profession or an occupation, it's something we take seriously, and we demand levels of training and experience that we seek to pass on from one generation to the next. Now, there are critics who will point out that we do not always live up to these standards, and they are right. Newspapers are written and edited by human beings. We get things wrong. The history of our craft is tarnished down the centuries by episodes of timidity, partisanship, gullibility, and downright corruption on the part of major news organizations. My own paper pretty much decided to overlook the Holocaust. But the idea of fair play, of checking our facts and reporting alternative points of view, is embedded in our culture and incorporated in our professional DNA. And at least in modern times, and at least at the serious news organizations, we have tried to be vigilant about policing our own credibility and correcting the record when we get something wrong. As the country grows more polarized and cynical, there's growing pressure on journalists to abandon the effort to be impartial, to openly take a side, and to write accordingly. Some of our critics insist that pure objectivity is unattainable, so why try? To me, that's a little like saying that because so much of our children's future is ordained by genetics, we should abandon the business of being parents. Impartial journalism, like child rearing, is an aspiration, but it is a worthy one. And unlike your children, a daily newspaper affords you the chance to start all over the next day and this time get it right. In short, to sum up this little detour through the ethics of journalism, our mission is not to tell readers what we think or what they ought to think, but to supply them as best we can the basis to make up their own minds. So when it comes to national security, it's not my job to tell you whether eavesdropping without warrants or military tribunals or waterboarding are legitimate tools of national security. My job is to tell you what you need to know to judge for yourselves how the government is doing its job of keeping you safe. Since September 11, 2001, doing that job has sometimes presented editors with excruciating choices. On several occasions, editors of major papers have withheld information because we were convinced that publishing it would put lives at risk. On other occasions, we've decided to publish classified information over strong objections from the government. These decisions are not driven by partisan animus, and they are certainly not driven by indifference to the fate of the country. This is not, no matter how much some politicians would like to cast it this way, a contest between a liberal press and a conservative White House. In fact, journalists at the Times have a large and personal stake in this country's security. For starters, we live and work in a city that has been tragically marked as a favorite terrorist target. Our journalists plunged into the fiery ruins of September 11th. We have correspondents today on the front lines of the two wars still being waged in the wake of that attack in Iraq and Afghanistan. Baghdad's an unnerving city where every traffic jam feels like a death trap and every conversation seems to turn on calculations of danger. When I was there in May, I was chatting with one of the bureau drivers and I asked which of the two bureau cars he preferred, the Mercedes or the BMW, the two bulletproof cars that are generally preferred by professionals who operate in Baghdad. And I figured I'd get a professional opinion of the acceleration or the turning radius of the two cars. He thought for a second and he said, well, he preferred the BMW because it has a wider back seat, so you have more room to dress a wound if somebody gets shot. This is not a point of comparison that I recall seeing in the annual Car and Driver magazine roundup of luxury cars, but it's the way you learn to think if you're a reporter in Iraq. The Times has 7 correspondents assigned to Iraq, plus a rotating cast of photographers. They work in this high-risk environment because, while there are lots of places you can go for opinions about the war, there are few places, and fewer by the day, where you can go to find honest, on-the-scene reporting about what's happening. We take extraordinary precautions to keep them safe, but I've had the unbearable task of calling the parents of 2 Times journalists to report that their children had been abducted by very bad men. Thankfully, they were released. Our stringer in Basra was not so lucky. He was dragged from his home by men in police uniforms and executed, almost certainly in reprisal for his reporting on corruption in the police force. While I was in Baghdad in May, I met his widow and 3 small children. I also spent some time with some of the 80 Iraqis we employ, mostly stringers around the country who work in towns where it's no longer safe for Westerners, but also security, translators, support staff of various kinds. These colleagues and friends take extraordinary risks. They take the most circuitous routes to work. They lie to their children about what they do because they could easily be murdered if their neighbors discovered that they work for an American company. My point is this: although we report what we see, whether it's pleasing or not, we are not indifferent. I expect that if Iraq collapses, the correspondents of the New York Times will feel the tragedy more viscerally, more personally, than most of the policymakers who got us there. We are invested in the struggle against murderous extremism in another sense. The virulent hatred espoused by terrorists, judging by their own literature, is directed not just against our people and our buildings, it's also aimed at our values and at our faith in the self-government of an informed electorate. If the freedom of the press makes some Americans uneasy, it is anathema, it is heresy to the ideologists of terror. So we have no doubts about where our sympathies lie in this clash of ideologies. And yet, we cannot let those sympathies transform us into propagandists, even for a system we revere. The conflict between the government's passion for secrecy and the press's drive to reveal is not of recent origins. I'll quote you a favorite passage from the Supreme Court. "The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the government would remain forever free to censure, so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of the government and inform the people." That was 35 years ago in the Supreme Court ruling that stopped the government from suppressing the secret Vietnam War history known as the Pentagon Papers. That was Justice Hugo Black. So this did not begin with the Bush administration, although the polarization of the electorate, the daunting challenge of terrorism, and this administration's devotion to executive secrecy have made relations between the press and government as abrasive as at any time since Justice Black wrote his opinion. In recent years, aggressive reporters have brought you a great deal of information the White House never intended for you to know. Classified secrets about the questionable intelligence that led the country to war in Iraq, about the abuse of prisoners in Iraq and Afghanistan, about the alleged massacre in Haditha, about the transfer of suspects to countries whose interrogation techniques we prefer not to know about eavesdropping without warrants. Just last month, we brought you an account of the recent National Intelligence Estimate, a classified consensus of the 16 intelligence agencies, which concludes that, in contrast to the official White House view, the war in Iraq has made the terror threat worse, not better. As Bob Kaiser, the associate editor of the Washington Post, asked not long ago in the pages of his newspaper, "You may have been shocked by these revelations or not disturbed by them at all, but would you have preferred not to know them? If a war is being waged in America's name, shouldn't Americans understand how it is being waged?" Government officials understandably want it both ways. They want us to protect their secrets, and they want us to trumpet their successes. This, too, is nothing new. I hope you'll indulge me another wallow in the Pentagon Papers case. Although the specific issue at the time, which was whether the government could restrain the press from publishing, whether it could censor the news, is not quite the issue we face now, the debate over the Pentagon Papers produced a rich literature on the subject of government secrets. And one of the finest documents to emerge from the voluminous legal history of that case is the affidavit filed at the district court level by one of my predecessors, Max Frankel. At the time, Max was the paper's Washington bureau chief, and in his affidavit, he described the role of secrets in the ritual life of Washington. And here's what he said: "Presidents make secret decisions only to reveal them for the purposes of frightening an adversary nation, wooing a friendly electorate, protecting their reputations. The military services conduct secret research in weaponry only to reveal it for the purpose of enhancing their budgets, appearing superior or inferior to a foreign army, gaining the vote of a congressman, or the favor of a contractor. The Navy uses secret information to run down the weaponry of the Air Force. The Army passes on secret information to prove its superiority to the Marine Corps. High officials of the government reveal secrets in the search for support of their policies or to help sabotage the plans and policies of rival departments. Middle-rank officials of government reveal secrets so as to attract the attention of their superiors or to lobby against the orders of those superiors." That's very much the way things still work in Washington. Treasury Secretary John Snow shortly before he left the government this summer, declared that he was scandalized by our decision to report on the bank monitoring program. But in September 2003, the same Secretary Snow invited a group of reporters to travel with him and his aides on a military aircraft for a 6-day tour to show off the department's efforts at tracking terrorist financing. The Secretary's team discussed many sensitive details of their monitoring efforts, hoping they would appear in print and demonstrate the administration's relentlessness against the terrorist threat. One man's security breach is another man's PR campaign, and sometimes they're the same man. Max Frankel, in his Pentagon Papers affidavit, acknowledged the self-serving nature of these transactions on both sides, but he concluded that this cooperative, competitive, antagonistic, and arcane relationship, as he called it, was essential to the working of democracy. Without this trafficking in secrets, he said, there could be no adequate diplomatic, military, and political reporting of the kind our people take for granted, either abroad or in Washington, and there could be no mature system of communication between the government and the people. How do we, as editors, reconcile the obligation to inform, which is our fundamental purpose, with the responsibility to protect? Sometimes the judgments are easy. Our reporters in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, take great care not to divulge operational intelligence in their reports, knowing that in this internet age it could be seen and used by hostile combatants. Often, though, the calculations are more different. There is no magic formula, no neat metric, either for the public's interest or for the dangers of publishing sensitive information. We make our best considered judgment. When we come down in favor of publishing, of course, everybody hears about it. When we exercise restraint, most of the time, few people are aware. But editors of major papers have, in the past few years, had the experience of withholding or postponing articles when the administration convinced us that the risk of publication outweighed the benefits. The Washington Post, in disclosing that the CIA was imprisoning terror suspects at secret locations in allied countries, withheld the identities of the host countries at the urging of the White House. The Los Angeles Times chose not to publish the contents of computer hard drives purchased by reporters in an Afghan bazaar. The hard drives were either stolen or discarded from official American outposts in the country, and they contained information about American espionage and surveillance activities in Afghanistan. My paper has held articles that, if published, might have jeopardized efforts to protect vulnerable stockpiles of nuclear material. Probably the most discussed example was my decision not to disclose the NSA eavesdropping program when we first learned about it. It took more than a year of further reporting before I was convinced that we knew enough to publish despite the President's personal plea for secrecy. For that caution, the Times was castigated by critics of the Bush administration, who speculated that if we had rushed the information into print before the 2004 elections, the outcome might have been different. I tend to doubt that that's so, but in any case, I could not, in good conscience, publish the story until I was confident the public value of exposing the program outweighed the danger of putting lives at risk. I understand that that honorable people may disagree with any of these choices, a decision to publish or a decision not to publish. But making these decisions is the responsibility that falls to editors, a corollary to the great gift of our independence. It is not a responsibility we take lightly, and it is not one we can surrender to the government, which has no interest in disclosing its own transgressions or abuses. This is exactly why the inventors of this country, having emerged from an imperial form of government, embraced an unruly press, and the press in their day was at least as unruly as it is today. At this point, some of you may be asking under your breath, okay, Mr. Wise Guy editor, now what? How do we prevent this collision of secrecy and press freedom from becoming a spectacular pileup in the courts? How do we avoid the international embarrassment of, pardon the expression, editors in chains? I'm not a lawyer, nor am I a policymaker. I've always been happier on the sidelines of history, covering the game without having to call in plays. What follows is the view of one editor, and it will be more rumination than prescription. One of the hangovers of my Catholic upbringing is that I tend to divide things into threes. In this case, I think of the problem from three directions: the newsroom, the law, and the government. Frankly, I don't see a way to change journalistic practice to avoid clashes with the government, short of adopting the kind of deferential mouthpiece journalism common to countries with one-party governments. As journalists in a robust democracy, our responsibility is to publish information of interest to the public, and that includes publishing secrets when we can find them. We are constrained by the professional code I summarized earlier. We feel obliged to be careful in what we publish, careful to get it right, careful to play it straight, and careful to consider any reasonable claim that publication will put lives in danger. In the cases I've described, I believe we satisfied those obligations. However, there is one thing we can do that may improve our standing in this perennial contest with the government. We can be a little more judicious in our use of anonymous sources. Just to be clear, the ability to offer protection to a source is an essential of our craft. None of the stories I described earlier would have been reported without recourse to this tool. You will occasionally hear an editor suggest that news organizations should forswear anonymous sources altogether. This is high-minded foolishness. Without the option of protecting sources, with recourse only to an increasingly redacted public record, the coverage of government and other powerful institutions would tend more and more towards press conference stenography. But a more selective and clear-headed use of unnamed sources could have two beneficial effects, I think. First, it could improve our credibility with the public, which ultimately decides the fate of press-bashing politicians. I suspect that the media's heavy reliance on unattributed information contributes to a suspicion that reporters make things up or that newspapers allow themselves to be used on behalf of one agenda or another. The too casual reliance on unnamed sources is both corrosive and unnecessary. At the Times, we've tried to push reporters to get more information on the record and to assure that when anonymous sources are cited, we tell our readers whatever we can say about the trustworthiness and motivation of the source. We require that one editor know the identity of any unnamed source. The editor's role in this case is to press the reporter to make sure that anonymity is justified and to make as clear as possible in the story how the sources came by their knowledge and whether they had any axes to grind. When stories are backed by documents or on-the-record sources, they inevitably are more persuasive. That's one significant benefit of thinking harder about how we use anonymous sources. And here's another. In some cases, a reporter may be able to limit his legal exposure by being more explicit with sources about just how far he's willing to go in protecting information. I spent about a dozen years of my working life in Washington where the notion of background or deep background is most embedded in the culture. I understand that much reporting begins with informal, off-the-record conversations in pursuit of news. This is a kind of journalistic foreplay. And it's valuable. But information acquired in this fashion is not, or should not be, automatically shoveled into the newspaper. At the end of the reporting process and before publication, there is usually a negotiation between the reporter and the source. What can I use? How can I attribute it? Can we agree to put some of this on the record? It's not a great leap to include in that negotiation the question of what happens if the story provokes an official leak investigation. I know a few reporters who already make a habit, after learning what the source knows and before writing a story, of negotiating a kind of verbal contract. It may go something like this. I'll keep your name out of the paper, and if I'm subpoenaed as part of a leak investigation, my paper will fight it in the courts. But if we lose in the courts, I do not plan to go to jail or allow the paper to be fined into bankruptcy. There may be cases where we risk losing an exclusive because the source will not accept these terms. There may be stories so momentous that we are willing to, in effect, bet the paper. But this approach allows us to assess the stakes before publication rather than after a judge has handed down a contempt order. A lot of reporters I know reject this approach, fearing it will chill relations with sources. Maybe they're right. But in the absence of clear-cut legal protections, we should at least consider doing everything we can to make sure that a decision to defy a subpoena turns on the importance of the information conveyed, not on the happenstance of a deal made or implied on the fly. None of what I have just proposed offers any comfort to those who believe we should stop publishing secrets. It might, however, put us in a somewhat less precarious position when we do publish secrets. This brings us to the state of the law. The Espionage Act aside, the main legal threat facing journalists these days is the subpoena. in particular the subpoena issued as part of a government leak investigation or in civil suits where a litigant is trying to establish the identity of a source who disclosed damaging information. In the decades after the Supreme Court in the 1972 Brandsburg case left reporters vulnerable to being summoned before grand juries, there were relatively few cases in which reporters were compelled to reveal confidential sources, until recently. Over the past 2 years, though, federal courts have issued 36 subpoenas asking for identities of confidential sources in criminal and civil cases. And those are just the cases that have come to the attention of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. The Times is currently embroiled in 3 such cases, not including the NSA eavesdropping leak investigation, which has yet to reach us. To many of us in the journalism business, the great hope has been for a federal shield law which would afford reporters at least some protection against being forced to divulge sources, the kind of protections already accorded to defense counsel, doctors, ministers, and other professionals whose work depends on assurances of confidentiality. Like many journalists, I'm uneasy in the role of supplicant before Congress and a little nervous about what a shield law might look like after making its way through the world's greatest deliberative body. But shield laws have proven to be an invaluable safeguard of aggressive independent reporting at the state level without bringing the justice system to a standstill. 31 states and the District of Columbia have laws that help protect reporters' sources, and another 18 states have protections established by court precedent. But all of this is undermined by the lack of federal protection. Australia, Japan, Mexico, Germany, Italy, Norway, and other democracies have stronger legal protection of sources than the U.S. federal government. In Sweden, a journalist violates the law when he reveals a source who has been promised protection. And even in Britain, whose secrecy laws we tend to regard as draconian by comparison with our own, courts have called the confidentiality of sources, quote, one of the basic conditions of press freedom. The reality, however, is that enactment of a federal shield law does not seem imminent. So now we come to part 3, the government. The thing that has worked most effectively over the decades to maintain a healthy equilibrium between press freedom and national security is not something codified in the law. It is common sense. It is compromise and accommodation. I'm going to return once more to Max Frankel's affidavit in the Pentagon Papers case. He described for the court the unwritten but generally observed etiquette of what he called mature press relations. Quote, for the vast majority of secrets, there has developed between the government and the press a rather simple rule of thumb. The government hides what it can, pleading necessity as long as it can, and the press pries out what it can, pleading a need and a right to know. Each side in this game regularly wins and loses a round or two. Each fights with the weapons at its command. And when the government loses a secret or two, it simply adjusts to the new reality. Alexander Bickel also worked over this issue in his seminal volume of legal philosophy, The Morality of Consent. Bickel was the chief counsel for the Times in the Pentagon Papers case. It tickles me to know that his meditation on press freedom first appeared in 1972 in the magazine Commentary, the same magazine that recently consigned me to a traitor's cell. Bickel argues that ambiguity and ambivalence are the lubricants that allow the First Amendment to function. The government, he writes, has the right and the responsibility to protect legitimate secrets, and yet it is constrained in many ways in what it can do to guard those secrets. It may not legally break and enter, or steal, or spy electronically without a judicial warrant. It cannot restrain anyone from publishing a secret unless it can prove immediate harm of the gravest sort. Quote, we have no Official Secrets Act and can have none restraining publication of most secrets. The government cannot copyright anything. The government has great power to enforce secrecy at the source, but has little recourse once the secrets have escaped. The government may guard mightily against serious leaks, and yet must suffer them if they occur, Bickel wrote. The accommodation works well only when there is forbearance and continence on both sides, he concluded. It threatens to break down when the adversaries turn into enemies, when they break diplomatic relations with each other, gird for and wage war. Such conditions threaten graver breakdowns yet, eroding the popular trust and confidence in both government and the press, on which effective exercise of the function of both depends, end quote. This argument, of course, assumes a respectful, if adversarial, relationship between an establishment press and a government that accepts the value of compromise in the conduct of public affairs. It's arguable whether we have either of those things today. The notion of an establishment press is at least under siege. The Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, and the 3 television networks and their kin are no longer society's common source of news to the extent that they were in the past. Journalism has become a wide-open market. News comes from a dizzying number of directions, especially on the web. This democratization of the media has brought healthy change, introducing new voices and new audiences to the national conversation. But it has contributed to a blurring of the very definition of who is a journalist. I think a news organization like mine should be a little humble about trying to define who's entitled to be called a journalist. And personally, I would advocate a fairly expansive definition. But it's pretty obvious that the legions of internet journalists include at least a few who would feel no compunction about disclosing life-threatening information. I suspect the official custodians of America's secrets would say that Max Frankel's rule of thumb, the idea that the government should accept an occasional loss and learn to live with it, is inoperative in a world where anyone with an internet service provider can be a journalist. If a blogger hostile to the Bush administration managed to document sensitive secrets about the war on terror, would he stop to weigh the consequences of making them public? And once the information had rebounded through the blogosphere, how long would the major news organizations hesitate before picking it up? So far, this fear is largely theoretical, and for at least one good reason. Mainstream news organizations are far more likely to have reporters dedicated to the hard, painstaking work of reporting on national security issues, developing sources, building trust, piecing together details into patterns. Contrary to popular mythology, sensitive secrets do not generally fall into our hands. They may begin with a tip from a source who has a grievance or a guilty conscience, but those tips are just the beginning. Reporters operate without security clearances, without subpoena powers, without spy technology. They work rather with sources who may be scared, who probably know only part of the story, who may have their own agendas that need to be discovered and taken into account. Reporting secret information with confidence usually entails a multitude of sources, ideally backed by documentary evidence. One of the striking things about the NSA eavesdropping story is that more than a year elapsed between the time our reporters dug out the information and the time we published it, and yet it did not surface anywhere else. The information was that hard to get. So while the mainstream press might not enjoy the hegemony it held before the internet, we have not yet fallen into information anarchy. Most of what the country knows about the secret activities of its government, it knows thanks to serious news organizations that still take their responsibilities seriously. Across the table, however, we have a government that is not inclined towards, in Bickel's phrase, forbearance and continence. A government that favors the language of moral clarity, of black and white, of with us or against us. And it must be said, there seems to be a considerable public constituency for that attitude. The White House and its allies have done an excellent job of making this debate about the press. Much has been said about the ostensible dangers of newspapers publishing news of wiretapping or bank surveillance or secret prisons, dangers which, to the best of my knowledge, have not so far come to pass. I'd like to turn the telescope around and pose this question. What are the consequences for our national security of this White House zeal to tighten controls on the flow of information? Whatever you think of its policies, the current administration has been more secretive, more mistrustful of an inquisitive press than any since the Nixon administration. It has treated freedom of information requests with contempt, taken information off of government websites, asserted claims of executive privilege over documents. The administration has subsidized propaganda at home and abroad, refined the art of spin, discouraged dissent, and sought to limit traditional congressional oversight and court review. The war in Iraq alone is a case study of the administration's determination to dominate the flow of information, from the original cherry-picking of intelligence to the deliberate refusal to hear senior military officers when they warned of the potential for chaos, to the continually inflated claims about the progress in building up an indigenous Iraqi army. And when the administration's secrets have seeped out, the response has sometimes been to launch the FBI and to threaten reprisals. The attempt to use subpoenas against journalists is by no means confined to the realm of national security. U.S. attorneys seem to have gotten the message that the gloves are off, which explains why 2 reporters for the San Francisco Chronicle have been sentenced to 18 months for protecting the sources who helped them expose the baseball steroid scandal. That's more prison time than any of the actual defendants in that case face. The White House has not formally endorsed the creative view that the Espionage Act should be employed to criminalize journalism, but it has been in no hurry to disavow that draconian view either. And administration officials have been heard to suggest in private conversation that they would be tempted to propose a British-style Official Secrets Act, a move to criminalize reporting that many legal scholars regard or would regard as a frontal assault on the First Amendment. I strongly suspect that these attempts to enforce a single authorized version of the truth help explain why this most secretive of administrations has lost control of its most sensitive secrets. Military officers appalled by the rosy portrayal of our triumphs in Iraq, government lawyers disturbed by what they see as a cavalier attitude toward civil liberties and the balance of powers, career intelligence officers who feel their work has been massaged to conform to what their superiors want to hear. I think you would find that these are among our best sources. Or as our media columnist Dave Carr wrote a few weeks ago, quote, leaks tend to affect ships that aren't seaworthy to begin with. Dave has a daughter at Michigan, by the way. The distaste for dissent has another cost. Fighting terrorists, whatever method you choose, depends on making alliances at home and abroad. It depends on a consensus of the civilized world. And I wonder whether the discrediting of honest critics has undermined the unity of purpose essential to such a struggle. In the October issue of the Atlantic Monthly, Jonathan Rauch makes an interesting argument. Let me read it. If the country seriously intends to prevent terrorism, then spying at home, detaining terror suspects, and conducting tough interrogations are practices that the government will need to engage in for many years to come. Instead of making proper legal provisions for these practices, Bush has run the war against jihadism out of his back pocket as a permanent state of emergency. He engages in legal ad hocery and trickery, treats Congress as a nuisance rather than a partner, and circumvents outmoded laws and treaties when he should be creating new ones. Rauch concludes, of all Bush's failings, his refusal to build durable underpinnings for what promises to be a long struggle is the most surprising, the most gratuitous, and potentially the most damaging, both to the sustainability of the anti-terrorism effort and to the constitutional order. End quote. If that's true, then the stories I've been discussing, along with the reports about secret CIA prisons, the treatment of captives in Guantanamo and Afghanistan, and the outsourcing of prisoner interrogation, this coverage is not just something to defend as our constitutional right. It is something to be celebrated as our obligation to the national good. This coverage has raised important questions about the proper balance between liberty and security, and about the limits on executive power in our democracy. It has somewhat emboldened the courts and Congress to play their assigned roles in the systems of checks and balances. It has blossomed into one of the most urgent political debates of our time, joining the question of how we protect ourselves to the question of what exactly it is we are protecting. And it is just possible that by forcing these questions onto the national agenda, the press has created the possibility of a national consensus, a foundation for the long defense of our freedoms. Speaking as a citizen, I hope it's not too late for that. And speaking as an editor, I hope that those of us in the journalism world are not so preoccupied by our struggling business model or so busy dumbing down and downsizing in pursuit of non-readers that we can't find time to think about and speak up about what our business is for. I'm supposed to leave some time for you to ask questions, or alternatively just to say, stuff it, Mr. Keller. So we'll do that. The first time I subjected myself to a university audience as the editor of the Times was at Columbia, and the first questioner approached the microphone and asked, would you like to comment on the charge that the New York Times covered up Bulgegate. This was right after the 2004 elections. You all know about Bulgegate? Well, of course you don't. We covered it up. How could you? Bulgegate was the theory that during the 2004 presidential debates, President Bush wore some kind of a listening device so that, I guess, Karl Rove or somebody could transmit the answers to him. I don't know how anybody who watched those debates could believe that somebody was piping him the answers, but there's no stopping a good conspiracy theory. Anyway, I thank you very much for your hospitality.
We can now have a few questions. The microphones are here. Please, anyone wishing to ask Mr. Keller a question, please go to the microphone. And please make your questions succinct. One question, please, per question.
It's on.
Mr. Keller, 5 days ago, the New York Times reported the Johns Hopkins study scientifically substantiated death toll in Iraq in excess of 600,000 souls. In the face of this evidence, based on polling more than 12,000 individuals in more than 1,800 households, how do you explain your paper's decision to suppress it, not to challenge the Bush administration's position on the nature, the motives of the war, and the conduct of the war?
First of all, if by suppressing you mean publishing a story that must have been about 1,000 words in the newspaper, then you've got a different definition of suppression than I do. We ran a very thorough story on that study. But wait a second. Okay, we didn't splash it on the front page.
That the study had no scientific basis. And look, this is a scale of death which is comparable to genocide. Mm-hmm. At that rate of death in a country the size of the United States, the toll would be over 7 million. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a vast figure, far in excess of any assessment that's been made in the press, and nothing is being said about it. Not a single editorial since then. No comment. No question. That's the question that I want to raise.
Okay.
You know, in Vietnam, you mentioned the Pentagon Papers. I remember the reporting in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. At that time, had this type of information been made available, it would have been a huge scandal, reported on, editorialized on, studied repeatedly, and it's been buried. That's my question. Why has it been buried? Why has it been left?
I got it. I got your message. First of all, was that a follow-up question, or do I get to answer this one first? First of all, I don't regard publishing an extensive article which pointed out that there were some serious scientific questions about the validity of that study. What that was an epidemiological study where they surveyed Iraqi households and asked them how many people in your household have died. And then from that, they extrapolated to the entire country. It was a large sample and therefore, as we said in the story, a considerably more credible study than an earlier study they did with a study that was widely dismissed as insignificant. It was still an epidemiological study. Whether that study is more superior than the surveys that we routinely do of the Iraqi morgues, where they actually count the bodies, or the various other means that we have for calculating the death toll in Iraq, I don't think, you may want to believe that 600,000 is the number. I don't know that 600,000 is the number. The important number about the deaths in Iraq is that they are extraordinarily numerous and increasing. And anybody who reads the New York Times has no doubt of that, because we have reporters there who witness it. Seizing on one study and amplifying that into the anointed truth is not journalism. You're perfectly entitled to do it because the First Amendment protects you the same way it protects me, but that doesn't make it true.
I have a question about the use of streamers. how does it affect the news, actually, the truth that comes out?
Yes, the use of stringers is certainly more common in this conflict than it has been in previous conflicts, and more frequent than it was in the early days of the war, when reporters could safely drive around the country and see everything for themselves. And obviously that is not an ideal way to cover a war. We cover it in a variety of ways. First of all, our reporters do get out and travel. That's considerable peril to themselves. They sort of push the envelope of what the security personnel recommend that they do. They do a lot of that in Baghdad, and they do some of it out in the countryside as well. Second of all, we do have, as I said, about 80 Iraqi employees who work for us. They're people we know and trust. They're not mostly journalists, because there aren't a lot of Iraqi journalists around who we would know or trust given the regime that they grew up in. A lot of them are academics, they're engineers, they're doctors, and they're people that we have met in large part through relations with other Iraqis that we know very well, and people who work in our Baghdad bureau, for example. And even so, you know, because they're not experienced reporters, you have to be very careful taking the information that you get from stringers. We also do embeds, which is another non-ideal form of reporting, which is, reporters put on flak jackets and helmets and go out with now both American and Iraqi units who are doing patrols in the various cities around the country. An embed is kind of a pinhole view of the conflict. You don't, you see what the soldiers see. But those have also proven to be extremely valuable, because I will tell you that one of the most valuable sources about the dismay that rank-and-file soldiers feel in Iraq is rank-and-file soldiers that we bunk with when we go out on embeds.
Frankly, Mr. Keller, I really don't. I listened to your lecture. We're now getting into the fourth year of a war that was launched on the basis of lies. And I don't really think that your account in any way seriously addresses the enormous responsibility of the American media, including the New York Times, for allowing this catastrophe to happen. And what you have said about this study conducted by Johns Hopkins University's Bloomberg Institute of Public Health, one of the most, as I understand it, largest and most prestigious, employing the same methodology that is used to study the death toll from the famines. I believe it's the same methodology used in Sudan. In fact, it's methodology which, according to one of the co-authors, has been used by the United States government. And I might also add, the people who conducted the survey did so at considerable risk to themselves in the horrible nightmare environment created by the United States intervention there. To simply dismiss it, to pretend this is not a major story. You said in your lecture your job is to give the people the information they need. I maintain you are not doing that.
First of all, I did not. Well, if you want to come up here and take the lectern, you're welcome to it. I'm about talked out.
I just would like to give one other example very briefly. Okay, the story on the NSA domestic spying. Your public editor published an article in a column in August, in which he, based on an interview with you, explained that the New York Times had the information on this illegal domestic spying program as far back as the summer of 2004. According to his column, articles were being produced, drafts were being produced, it dragged on for weeks. There was a fresh draft ready to go a week before the election. You were in discussions, or the Times was in discussions with the Bush administration, which wanted to kill the story. The American people had a right to know, in my opinion, before they went to the polls in November of 2004, that one of the candidates, the incumbent president, was violating the 1978 Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, violating the Constitution, and violating the privacy rights of the American people. The New York Times made a decision not to publish that story. The people had a right to know about that before they voted. And I'll finish. I'll make one. The claim was made in that column by Mr. Colomé. If I can just finish. All right, fine.
Okay, first, I'll breeze through the three questions as quickly as I can. First of all, anybody who's interested in the Johns Hopkins study can go to the New York Times website and look up our study and judge for yourself whether it was a fair and even-handed study report of that study or not. You can go to the Johns Hopkins websites and read the actual study and make up your own mind. That study, by the way, was conducted by Iraqi stringers, the same kind of people who do the reporting for the New York Times, and I admire their courage the same way I admire the courage of the people who work for us. The complicity of, or the responsibility that the media hold for going to war, absolutely. You know, I mean, I wrote our editor's note owning up to the credulous reporting that our paper published in the run-up to the war. Although, you know, it's a little hysterical to suggest that, you know, Judy Miller in the New York Times took the country to war in Iraq as if the Bush administration had nothing to do with it. You know, the American media let the country down in its reporting before the war. That said, the notion that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction was not an eccentric notion in the year before the United States invaded Iraq. It was the prevailing view of most of the people who had inspected in Iraq. It was the prevailing view of the Clinton administration and the Democratic Party. It was the prevailing view of the scientists who study Iraq. It was the prevailing view of the UN Security Council. So, yes, the press. Okay.
Linda Greenhouse.
Yes. I know, Linda Greenhouse. You all know what that question is about. I expect lots of heads nodding up and down. Okay.
On the specifics of Linda Greenhouse, I'm just going to say what I told our public editor on this subject, and maybe a little bit more, which is, you know, I've talked to Linda about this episode. I don't go public with my conversations with people on my staff, but I will certainly say what I've said in public many times, both before and after her speech at Harvard, which is that I think she's one of the world's great reporters. I think she is scrupulously fair in what she writes about the Supreme Court, and has been for decades. I think she is a treasure. I'm happy to talk about the general issue that was stirred up by this, because our former public editor, Dan Okrent, leapt into the fray and said, why should newspapers have a policy that limits the freedom of reporters to go out and declare their political views in public? And I think that's a fair question and a fair subject for debate. It's a debate we've had on several occasions at the Times and has been resolved in favor of having such a policy. The most important thing is that reporters are capable of keeping their personal politics out of the articles that they write. And I think we do that. But that's not the only thing. At least at the Times and a lot of other newspapers, we've set the bar higher than that. We have a number of provisions written in an ethics code that every reporter has and that reporters by and large approve of because they think it sets us apart from people who don't have such a code. And in that code, we build in a number of safeguards. For example, reporters cannot join a political campaign. They can't make contributions to candidates. They cannot accept gifts. They cannot, travel writers cannot take free airplane trips and hotel rooms. Editors who oversee coverage of business can't own stocks in any company that might conceivably be written about. That includes me. You could say that these are, beyond Caesar's wife in their extremity, but reporters live with them and expect that they help establish our general reputation for integrity and credibility. One of the rules is that you cannot, in a public place, pronounce your opinions on a controversial issue that you might be covering. That's the one that was, at issue in this. And, I guess my first reaction is you can argue whether or not we should have such a policy, but we do, and everybody at the paper knows it. But I would argue that we should. I would argue that there is a value, and it comes in, the value is twofold. One of them is that while the really important thing is the integrity of what the paper publishes, appearances do matter. And anything that a reporter does or an editor that plants a sliver of doubt in the minds of the public about their trustworthiness, about whether they can approach an issue with an open mind, is to some extent damaging to the reporter and damaging to the paper. And the second thing is, rules like this are not made to protect the strong of character. They're made to protect frail human beings. If you take a free hotel room, probably you could draw on your courage and write a scathing review of the service at the hotel, but maybe not. Maybe you'd feel just a little bit of obligation to be a little nicer to that hotel. And likewise, if you have declared your point of view on a political matter, if you've said that you like candidate X in a race, or that you would vote thus and so on a particular issue, you've kind of made a public investment. I'm not talking about having an opinion or voting or having a conversation over the dinner table, but if in a public audience you declare such an opinion, you've kind of taken a stake and planted it in the ground. And there may be a little part of your brain that says when you sit down to write, I've got a position to defend here. That at least is the logic behind that policy. And I think it makes sense, and in fact, as I say, most of the people who, this was certainly true in the discussion after the recent articles, people believe very strongly that it's important to have a code like that to set ourselves apart from a lot of other places that don't impose those sorts of restrictions.
One other question.
That actually was my question as well, but I wanted to follow it up by asking you, can you envision a situation where a reporter's responsibility as a citizen would overcome their responsibility as a journalist?
Give me a for instance.
Well, I could imagine the New York Times reporting one day that Dick Cheney decided to put all homosexuals into concentration camps in Guantanamo and just do it with a straight face and objectively reporting it or something like that. And you mentioned the silence of the New York Times during the Nazi period. It just seems to me there are boundaries that can be crossed that are not legitimate. But I wanted to know if you could imagine, how bad could it get before Linda Greenhouse's comments would be seen as legitimate?
Well, let's be clear on one thing. Linda Greenhouse has not been publicly flogged. She has a job and will have one as long as I'm executive editor. So, you're asking me to impose my standards of what a citizen owes to the country on somebody else, and that's a matter of individual conscience. But the question that I would pose, I guess, in answer to that is, in the given situation, can you do more good by retaining the role of an impartial observer and exposing a truth that you think will drive people to action, or is your better course to leave the zone of impartiality and go become an advocate? And that's a question of individual conscience that I wouldn't presume to answer for anybody.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, is there?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
No questions for women here. Women are not as fast to their feet to